Hi folks, and welcome back to Fishing with Den. Except we're not fishing today. As you can see, the weather's really terrible. It's pouring down with rain, it's howling a gale, and frankly I'm not going out in that. So I thought what we do today is I'll show you how to make some fishing floats. In this case, the Insert Waggler. And here we are. This is a selection of Wagglers, inserts as I say, the insert being this part of the top here. These ones are relatively thick, as you can see. This one's a little bit narrower, and they do actually go down to some fairly thin ones. Now I have discussed which Wagglers to use in the past in one of my previous videos, but basically if you're fishing and you want to get really finicky fine bites, use a thin one, and if it's windy or if there's a drag on the water, you're going to wind up using one of these thicker ones. You'll probably wind up having to make quite a few different Wagglers, including some with different coloured tops. And the reason for that, of course, is that the background can be light or dark depending on the day. It can also be different depending on wind conditions. So you do need a selection of Wagglers. And what I'm going to show you today is the absolute cheapest set of Wagglers you can ever make for yourselves. Let me just grab them now. Well, of course, these haven't actually been made yet. This is the raw material, and it's absolutely free. You can find this on virtually any riverbank or lake, anywhere in the world. Might be slightly different in different countries. I know in the UK they have Norfolk reed. I'm sure in America and Australia there's all sorts of different ones. But really, it's just this lightweight reed that you find on the riverbank. So what we do is we cut them down. And if I take just this one as an example, what you have to do is to just peel off any loose material, and then we just cut it at these joints here, as you can see. Now you can cut it with a craft knife or a hacksaw, or in my case I use the bandsaw. Whatever you use, just be a little bit careful because you don't want to crack them open, and of course that'll make them leak. So let me just show you how I cut them down on the bandsaw. So first things first then, this section here isn't too bad. No loose bits, but there's a loose piece here, so let's just get rid of that. Just work your way up, taking the loose pieces off. These are dead, remember, because I collected them in the winter. That's okay. Oh, maybe not. There we go. Just work your way all the way up to the end. Doesn't matter if you don't get all of the residual pieces off, because you can clean that up later. Okay, so now what we're going to do, I'll turn the bandsaw on. Just get rid of this end piece. There we go. That was a bit bent. So we're going to cut off just before this knuckle here. You see? Hollow. And then obviously we have to get rid of the knuckle itself. And just repeat the process all the way through. So after a couple of minutes of cutting, you end up with a selection of thicknesses and lengths, and the idea is to insert one into the other, as I showed you originally, so you've got an insert Waggler. This one is a particularly thick tip, so you might want to consider making both of these areas shorter and inserting a thinner tip into this area here. Now, I've done that on this one, as you can see. So it really just goes to show you the versatility of this thing. You can go to quite a thick one or a thin one, you can have a long one, you can make it shorter, you can pull the whole thing in. Okay, obviously it is going to be fixed in position shortly once we've glued it all in, but just when you put the thing together, just give yourself a rough idea and then you can get the glue going. Okay, now I'm actually going to put just a peg in the bottom of these. A lot of floats these days, this is a shop bought one, and it has a ring or an eye on the bottom. And that's fine, you can put the line through that, but if ever you decide during the session you need to change your float, you're stuck because you've got to break off, and that doesn't help. So what I use is these things. Okay, they're called Waggler adapters. If you're in the UK, you can buy them in tackle shops. If you're elsewhere in the world, you can buy them on eBay. They cost virtually nothing, but frankly, I make my own. All I did was to get a size 10 swivel. Doesn't really matter what size you've got. That's a piece of valve rubber from a bicycle, if you can still get it in your area. These days, of course, most things are throwaway, but I bought about 5 meters of this a few years ago, and that's going to last me forever. Then what you do, take the float, put the adapter on, push up, till it's properly on. There we go. And then you put your line through this one. And of course what that means is, when you come to change the float because of changing conditions, or maybe it's just a different colour or tip you wanted, just take that off, put the next float back on, and you're back in business. You may have to change a few bits of shot, but it's a lot better than having to break everything down. Now as far as the bases go, I've got a whole pile of bamboo skewers. Now I never use these for the tip sections, I only ever use them for the bases because they are more dense, and the float making material needs to be lightweight but quite strong, and that's why these reeds are virtually perfect for it. Of course there's other materials you could use. You could use things like bird feathers. Peacock quill in the UK is particularly useful, and that one's made out of a piece of peacock quill. So really what we're looking at here is the absolute basic sort of Waggler float. Very, very simple, very easy to make, and we'll get on with that now. For the purposes of the video, I'm going to use this one. It's quite a thick one, so hopefully it'll show up very well. The first thing you have to do is to make sure that you've got straight reed. And of course, you can just do that by wobbling it across the table, like so. Same for this one. You'll know if it's not straight because this one will be lifting up and down as it goes along. This one seems to be pretty reasonable. You're never going to get absolute perfection, but that's as good as we need it to be. So all reed has a sort of a covering on it. It's a waxy covering. It's obviously waterproof at some point, but we never actually just leave that on. The reason for that is that obviously this thing could be sitting in the water for hours on end, and it probably will take on a certain amount of water. So the idea is just to get rid of this waxy coating here. And to do that, I just use some fine sandpaper, or in this case emery paper, and just give it a rub, take off the coating. There we go. Do it for both ends. Doesn't take long to do. Slipping out of my hands, so just wet your fingers. There we go. Okay, so that's got the sheen off it, and we'll do the same for the other two bits. Okay, that's the 3 pieces already done. And of course, something I should mention is, once you've done the sanding down, just recheck to make sure that it fits properly. Now that's actually quite a sliding fit, but I'm going to be using this Araldite 5-minute epoxy. You could use super glue, it's not a problem, but I just happen to like Araldite because it gives me a shoulder rather than having this sharp corner on here. Okay, same for this one, just check that. Seems to go in the other end. There we go. Now this one's a slightly slacker fit, but the 5-minute epoxy will take up the slack around that. Okay, so what I've decided to do on this one is I'm not going to have the whole of this second section. I'm going to make a fairly short float, but with a reasonable tip section. So it's going to look something like that. I will push that down properly when I do the gluing, but so I can get the thing out now, I'll just do that. And what I will also do, of course, is just cut it off, so I've just got about that much going inside. No point in putting all this into it, it just adds weight and reduces buoyancy. So that's what we'll be doing. Now, as far as the tip goes, I'm having a fairly long tip. That's probably going on 50 millimeters or so. And the reason for that is that I like to fish with the lift method, which is where you have one shot just off the bottom. When the fish picks up the bait, it picks up the shot. And if this was sitting about there, it would actually rise up, so it's sitting more like that. And that's just personal preference. You don't have to do that. It's entirely up to you. As I said before, of course, you could also just have the 2 inserts, so it was a very thick one. And of course that would be for if it was a really windy day or there's a lot of tow on the water. Before you put everything together, there's a couple of extra things you need to do. The first one is to just go across the edges and just smooth them round. You don't want sharp edges because it's just something else for the line to catch on. Do both ends. There we go, and make sure it's nice and square at the bottom. If it's not, just put it on the sandpaper to give yourself a nice square edge. Now, I've already done that to these 2 inserts, and I've also cut that one down, which is going to become like a spigot to insert the thinner one. What we haven't spoken about is this end where the peg goes. Okay. Now, this is just a piece of bamboo skewer, barbecue skewer, and it's going to just sit like that in this end. Again, just chamfer the edges off, but basically those are the 4 parts of the float. Okay, I'll just mix up some 2-part epoxy. You don't need much at all. The thing is, if you're going to do a batch of these things, squeeze out. If you're going to do a batch of these things, you can do more epoxy, but bear in mind it is only 5-minute drying, so therefore you've got to be careful because it's going to be drying up on you. Right, just give this a quick stir. Nice and good mix. There we are. Just put that on one side a second. Okay, so first things first then, take the insert, put some glue on it, and just put it in. I often get glue on my hands, but I don't worry too much about that. And there we are. Now, I don't know if you can see that, but there's just a little bit of a shoulder on there, which makes it nice and smooth rather than having a sharp edge. Do the same for the bottom. Just get some glue on it. And what you will find is that if this is a slightly loose fit, as this one is, as you see, this 5-minute epoxy will help you to fill out the gap. And again, just use my finger just to do that. Okay, roll it on the table. Try not to dip your elbow on the glue. Have a quick look to make sure it's nice and centered. There we go. So that glue will now hold that in place. Give that a few minutes and we'll come back and we'll insert that one. As I say, normally you'd be making a batch of these things up all at once in different sizes. This one is probably, oh I don't know, 6 inches, 150 millimeters long by something like 5, maybe 6 millimeters wide. Obviously, your reed's going to vary. You can't guarantee it's going to be any particular thickness. So, you just have to judge it yourself. But that looks reasonable to me. Let's leave that one to dry for a bit. After a couple of minutes, just come back and just make sure that the epoxy has not sagged down as this one did. Because today is so cold, it's actually taking quite a while for this to cure. What you do find though is that after about 3 or 4 minutes, this stuff does go a little bit more sticky, and at that point what I do is I just check on here to see. Now this has only been a minute or so, and so it's still very loose as things stand, but once it gets a bit more sticky you can use your finger and just mould that again, and this time it won't sag anymore. Okay, so the first bit's all dry now, so I've mixed up a bit more of the two-part epoxy. This is the tip, a little bit on the end, and insert. Just clean off with your finger. You might want to wear some of those rubber gloves for this, people, but it's entirely up to you. And that's it. Just check to make sure you're level. That's slightly out, so there we go. Just a little bit of fine touching there. And generally I'll stand these up in a rack at this point so we don't get gravity pulling it round. The only other thing to be aware of course, is that you've got a hole in the end there, so just gently. I should have done this before really, but you get the idea. Just take it off. It gives you a nice domed end, and you're not going to get the thing filling up with water now. And so that's the basic float. Really, really simple. All we've got to do now is to paint it and varnish it, and we're ready to go. So that's the build finished then, folks. In part 2, I'll show you how to paint the tip and also seal the float so it's totally waterproof in all circumstances. I'll also show you how to work out what the shot capacity or the loading is for the float, and we'll mark that on the side for when you go fishing. So I hope you enjoyed this one and found it informative. If you did, don't forget, as usual, click the like button, and of course you can always subscribe. So until next time then, bye for now.